Hey everybody, it's Christine at Zeidman Development, and today I'd like to show you a few things that are unique to importing your education relationship information into the Razor's Edge using Importacular versus using a Razor's Edge native import. So one of the big things that's unique to this is the ability to work with multiple destinations at the same time. So if you've purchased just the education data destination, you won't see that benefit quite as much. But if you've purchased the education destination alongside the individual destination, you can potentially import a student, both of that student's parents, and the student's education relationship all at the same import. And you can create relationships between the student and the parents and each other. So lots of functionality with creating multi-layers in that importing process at the same time. So that's one area where this is helpful. A second area where this is helpful is working with those criteria sets to get really specific about what records you're matching to in the Razor's Edge. So one of the things that people use Importacular for a lot is importing when you don't have the Razor's Edge constituent ID or the Razor's Edge constituent ID in your data source. So the criteria sets in Importacular allow you to completely customize how your records in your data source are going to be matched to the records that are in the Razor's Edge. So I want to show you my criteria sets quickly, just to give you some ideas of how I've done this and ways that you could potentially do this for your import. So first of all, I want you to notice that I've added an alias. Now, generally, when you hear alias talked about with Razor's Edge, you think of things like a maiden name or an alternate name. Aliases can also be used to track an alternate ID number. So in this import situation, I wanted to use an alias to track my student IDs. And then I created a criteria set so that that alias is a criteria set. And if that student ID matches in Razor's Edge to the student ID in my data source, I'm going to link those two records, and I'm going to be able to update Razor's Edge knowing that that's the same student. Another thing that we can do with our criteria sets when you have the education data destination is you can work with class of. So sometimes when you're working with schools and data from schools, one of the complicated things is keeping track of your alumni as names change. And we know that names change for lots of different reasons, but when you're managing data and you don't know that that name has changed, sometimes you have a hard time identifying that student. So I've created a couple of samples here so you can see how this works. So the first one I opted for was first name, last name, and class of. So this means if the first initial and the last name and the class of match, then it's going to create a poor match, which means I have to review it to decide. And I chose that because I figured you could have multiple people in the same class, potentially with the last name of Smith and the first initial of T. So Tim Smith, Terry Smith, and Tom Smith would all match this, but I would have the chance as the data manager to review that before I import it. I could also work with a maiden name or maybe a nickname with that class here. Just an example of one way I could do that. Another example that I created was working with the first name and equivalents with the class of. So equivalents look for things like Bill, Will, William, Willie. Those are all first name equivalents. Now with this one, I did add a second layer to this to only pull my alumni. So I could use a constituent code here or an attribute or a query as a way to limit that pool so that we're not seeing too many of those first names with a class of. So just a way that we could potentially find Amanda Smith, who's now Amanda Jones. So hope that those are helpful for you in ways that you can identify those students as they're coming into Razor's Edge. As you're updating those education records, whether it's students or alumni, these criteria sets give you tons of functionality that you don't have in the Razor's Edge to allow you to precisely identify those records and avoid adding duplicates. The other thing where we can avoid adding duplicates are with our education records themselves. So let's first look at that education record, and then I'm going to show you how we can avoid adding duplicate education records. So when we open our education mapping, you can see that I've linked to source fields as well as default values. Source fields are fields in my data source. So today I'm working in a spreadsheet, so these are the column headers for my spreadsheet. If you're working with a tool like iSAMS, they're the fields in iSAMS. Default values are things that I want to assign to everyone. So you can see here, I have a school type set of K-12. So if everyone here is from a K-12, that's a good answer. Maybe not a good answer if I have a combination of undergraduate and graduate as well as K-12 or secondary school or whatever the term would be for you. But for right now, I've chosen that default to assign to everybody. The other piece that you can do while you're building this template is you have field settings here. Field settings allow you to make changes to this data as it's coming into the Razor's Edge, so you can keep it precisely how you need it. So great example of where we could use that field setting is a data transformation. So let's say that somebody has typed ISU in my spreadsheet, and I want ISU to become Illinois State University. Data transformation will make that happen so that we won't get any exceptions saying ISU is not in your code table. It's going to automatically change anytime we have ISU formatted that way into Illinois State University. So lots of pieces we can do with those field settings just in getting this template set up as well. But the other thing we can do here that you can't do in a Razor's Edge import is we can choose at this level whether or not we want to update existing education relationships or not. So first thing here is select education match settings. This means how do you want to decide if this education record matches one that's already in Razor's Edge? Now it says establishment. That is also a school name for some of you. That's establishment is familiar, and for others that is not. So I'm going to go ahead and check that. And then I can choose what else I want to check. So maybe I want to say establishment and class year, or establishment and is primary. Depending on what data you work with and what type of organization and what type of school you're at, that may or may not matter. But whatever you choose here, it has to match in order for Importacular to count this as matched education record. So I'm going to click on establishment and class of, which means if we're talking about Illinois State University, you have to both have an education relationship to Illinois State University, and you have to have the same class year. They have to be the same in order for it to count as a matched education record. Once it matches, you can decide what happens to a match. So the first one is going to add a new education relationship. No matter whether it matches or not. So it doesn't matter if it matches. You may end up getting a duplicate, but if you choose that, that means you didn't care if there's a duplicate. Second option is going to update Razor's Edge. So that means that if it matches, it's going to update Razor's Edge with the fields you chose in that template. The third option means that we are going to ignore all of the changes in your data source, and we're going to default to what's in the Razor's Edge. So you have a lot of choices here about what you want to do with that data as you're bringing it into the Razor's Edge. You can add education attributes as well as majors and minors depending on where you are. I know not all of our countries have the major and the minor both available, but those are options available for users in certain places. I hope that this is helpful in giving you some ideas of what you can do with this data destination and how it can help you bring your data into the Razor's Edge. Thank you so much for joining me today, and I hope you have a great day.